So we talked about the Blazers' loss to the Warriors. Like I said, on its face, not particularly troubling, but in the context of the season, you start to kind of, these sort of harsh realities of playing 20 NBA games are starting to settle in. Like, the Blazers are 10-10. They're 9-1 at home. They're 1-9 on the road. When they leave Portland, they're straight up bad. When they've been in the Moda Center, they're good to fine, right? Like, I think the Blazers could sit here and do nothing and finish fourth in the West. But I don't think they could. I think they could sit here and do nothing and not be in that upper echelon. Like, I think the middle of the West is kind of meh, and the Blazers aren't any better or worse than any of those teams right in the middle from like 4 through 10 in the West. They're just not in that upper tier. I think that was true Friday. I'm recording this on Sunday. The Blazers play the Jazz on Monday. This is Monday's show, so we'll recap the Jazz game on Tuesday. But like, I think the Jazz game will be a harsh sort of reality for the Blazers. Like, they're not in this upper tier of really good teams. And in fact, they're strikingly similar to where they were last year. If you will allow me to go back in time very briefly, we're going to look back a little bit here. When Terry Stotts was first fired in June, there was a press conference held, and Neil Olshey was in front of the mic, and he was asked by friend of the show, Jason Quick, Neil, do you think your job is in jeopardy? And Neil Olshey said defiantly, the 29th rated defense and losing the first round of the playoffs was not a product of the roster. He decided to blame Terry Stotts on a question that he could have just answered, no, I feel like all of our jobs are in jeopardy every day, and I'm doing my best to make a competitive roster. We feel like we could have done better, blah, 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 blah. A softball. The man was throwing a softball, and he struck out and fouled it off his own ankle. It's kind of how the press conferences have gone. But that became a mimetic to some extent, like a meme, is that a product of the roster. Last season, the Blazers were second in offense and 29th in defense. That's offensive rating and defensive rating. That's points scored per 100 possessions and points allowed per 100 possessions, courtesy of NBA.com. If you're maybe an old school fan or someone who's like maybe not familiar with it, the points per possession rankings is like very, very common now. Like, that's when people talk about offense to defense, they're talking about points per possession. They're talking about offensive and defensive rating. It's usually normalized to out of 100, but it's points per possession, and there's some math to estimate how the possessions work, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not just raw points per game and points scored and points allowed. I think we've moved beyond that as sort of a basketball intelligentsia. But the Blazers last year, second in offense, 29th in defense. So the second best offense in the league and the second worst defense in the league. By some measures, a historically bad defense. But I also think offenses are more obsessed with efficiency than they've ever been. So of course the defenses are going to be worse, and the rules have changed, et cetera, et cetera. But like, product of the roster, right? A bottom two defense, bad, straight up bad. Well, after 10 games, the Blazers are fourth in offense on the season, and they're 28th in defense. Seems pretty similar. And I think that's kind of the damning thing at this point, is that they seem pretty similar. The idea was that with an upgraded defensive bench, right, you add some better defenders on the bench. Larry Nance Jr., Cody Zeller, more Nazir Little, Tony Snell, who's like a capable veteran, and then some of your, Anthony Simons, who's not a defender, not a good defender. Like, he adds to your strength, right? Like, you kind of complement the edges. You were an elite offense last year, second in the league. You're going to maintain that sort of top 5 level, but you've made like enough changes to the defense that you can be a little bit better. And then the scheme is going to change on defense, and you're going to take strides. And I don't think it was reasonable. I know some people thought maybe the team would push towards the top 10. Those are real optimists. They don't host this show. That's not who I am. I think I've said that, like, I think this team's ceiling is something like a below average defense, like 15 to 17, right? Like, I don't think you can look at the Norm, CJ, Dame trio, who's going to play a ton of minutes together, and say like, oh, this team can be an elite defense. I thought this team could be a below average defense. I thought this team could be okay. But where they are, they're right back bottom 3 in the league. They're one of the bad defensive teams again. It's not a product of the roster. So if last year we were throwing Terry Stotts on the bus, but under the bus, do we do it to Chauncey Billups? No, it wasn't fair to Stotts then. It's not fair to Billups now. Players play. This is Jimmys and Joes versus X's and O's. You can change up the scheme. You can ask more out of guys on that end. But defense there's a sort of skill and nuance to it. And the Blazers lack some of that, and they also they have physical limitations. They don't play with plus length. Even I know there's like a group of people who are really obsessed with Norman Powell having long arms, and I think that's nice. But that means Norman Powell plays like he's 6'7", and like the value of length would be actually being 6'7" and have arms like you're 7 feet long, like plus length everywhere, like a real advantage, not just like competently long arms. Congratulations to Norm, one of my favorite players, but like he's an offensive player. That's what he is. So it's the roster still, it was the roster with Stotts and it's the roster with Billups. And while I do think Billups has made this team in some ways more has improved them in some like real tangible ways. Last year they were dead last in assist percentage, one of just like a team that did not share the ball. But some of that was stylistic, and some of that was Stotts' sort of comfort level. They've moved up to 15th in assist percentage. They're like middle of the road. That's a dramatic improvement. Like from dead last to average is a dramatic improvement. And you can see it in the way they play. The ball moves more. At their best, the ball moves more. They pick it apart. Even when it's just Dame and CJ kind of pounding the rock up top, they have more actions that involve those two and kind of make the defense have to pick their poison between Dame or CJ with Norm floating around on the weak side. Like, I think the offense has come, like, at least aesthetically and in terms of variety, I think Billups has done a pretty good job of improving this offense. The fact that they're like fourth and not second is kind of meaningless to me because Damian Lillard has missed some shots, and that's not a coaching problem. But like, I think you can look at the offense and see that it's better. And the defense, in theory, was supposed to take a similar step forward, even if it wasn't sort of tangible that you're supposed to point to and say, okay, I think they're getting better. And while I'm not like against the more aggressive and more sort of like active helping scheme of the Billups versus Stotts era. Stotts' whole scheme was to avoid rotations at all costs, and Billups's scheme is more to be sharper and smarter with rotations and get it, avoid rotations a little bit, but be smart about how you rotate and how you help and all those things. Like, it's different schematically, but players play. It's always been this way. It's always needed more nuance. It's not black and white where it's either the coach or the players, although there are some people who cover this team who are obsessed with making a choice, and I will allow them to do so. They've also been given a microphone in many cases, but it's never one thing or the other. It's always both. And the way that I think Stotts did poorly with a roster that was bad on defense, I think Chauncey Billups is not getting the most out of this team defensively with a roster that's going to be bad on defense. Their ceiling is something like slightly below average, and they're a bottom three team. But that's kind of what they were last year. It's kind of what we should have expected when they ran back the exact same group plus Larry Nance. I mean, plus Zeller and Nance, but like still, you kind of knew. They're 10-10 this year. At the 20-game mark last year, they were 11-9. They were 8th in offense and 28th in defense. They feel very similar. Of course, they didn't have, at this point last year, they'd already lost CJ McCollum and Yusuf Nurkic to injuries. That they'd missed 20 games, and Norm hadn't joined the team. He didn't join the team until about the 55-game mark. So it's not the same roster, but I think Norm Powell and Gary Trent Jr. are relatively comparable. I think Norm's a little bit better, but not like so significantly better that he would tilt the scales. Maybe he tilted the scales that they're 8th to 2nd on offense, like makes them better. But again, that's the side of the ball that he excels on, despite maybe what you've been sold. So all of this is to say that they feel really similar to last season in statistically, and they were going to play faster and share the ball more. They've moved from 19th in pace to 16th in pace. They're playing a little bit faster. They're sharing the ball a lot more. And the offense is slightly worse, but not really like importantly or like in any statistically significant way worse. They're a top 5 offense and they're a bottom 3 defense. They're basically exactly where they were a year ago. If it's not a product of the roster, it's a product of the coaching staff. But I look at the coaching staff and don't think that it's a problem. They don't think that they're the problem necessarily. It's actually a collective group. Here we are. You play with what you have. You coach with what you have. It's always needed more nuance. And here's the place I hope to give you more nuance. The players aren't very good, and the coaching staff hasn't magically changed them because it wasn't going to. Again, I think there was a lot of people who believed it would. And I'm not saying that Billups is a bad coach. I'm just saying that the roster, the talent you have in this league, in the talent league of the NBA, is always going to be the most important factor.